Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of this very important book, the Reconstruction as Violence in Assad's Syria, which is co-edited by Dr. Deen Sharp, which we are very lucky tonight to have him with us here. And also another co-editor, Nasser Rabbat, who is a director of Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT, which we hope we are recording this, and I hope Nasser will see the recording at some point. This event is co-organized by the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, DPU, and UCL Urban Lab, together with my colleague, Professor Ortiz, who is the director of the Urban Lab. My name is Azadeh Mashayekhi. I'm a lecturer at the Development Planning Unit, and I'm also the convener of DPU Urban Transformation Cluster. This book is coming at the perfect time for us, especially at DPU, because we recently launched a public seminar series on the relationship between violence and urban planning and development. We already had 2 seminar series, which maybe some of you joined, and Deen was part of the last event, which was last week on Thursday. We looked at the intersection of urban planning, violence, and displacement. It was a very interesting conversation. If you missed it, we are going to put the recording on our website so you can follow up with that. And stay tuned for the other seminars which will be happening in the next academic year. So I can't say enough how much this book is relevant and complementary to the work that we've been doing at DPU, and at the same time the close collaboration we have with UCL Urban Lab, which share the same concerns that we have at the DPU. And of course, Catalina is part of the DPU, it's very connected to what we are doing, so our interest is overlapping and complementary to each other. So that's why this is a joint force to make this book launch happening. I'm going to give you an idea of how basically Deen designed these next 2 hours for us to learn more about the book. In the first part, Deen and Wendy Pullan and Emma DiNapoli will give us the overview of the book and how it came about and some of the key contributions of the book. And in the second part, Catalina will introduce the speakers, and we will get a more fresh view on the book, because the contributors are just coming back from Syria, so I think this is a very nice way of dividing the event into 2 parts. I'm going to introduce the first speakers, starting with Deen Sharp. Is an LSE visiting fellow in human geography and environment, and a senior advisor for the Aga Khan Prize for Architecture. He was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Aga Khan Program at the MIT, and the co-director of Forum Center for Advanced Urban Research. Deen Sharp is the co-editor with Claire Panetta of Beyond the Square, Urbanism and the Arab Uprising, published by Urban Research in 2016, and the co-editor with Michael Sorkin, Open Gaza, Architectures of Hope, published by Forum and the American University in Cairo Press 2021. He has also published in Progress in Human Geography, Urban Studies, and the Journal of Architecture. Wendy Pullan is a professor of architecture and urban studies at the University of Cambridge and director of the Center for Urban Conflicts Research. From 2014 to 2017, she served as head of the Department of Architecture. She was principal investigator of conflict in cities and the contested state, which earned her the RIBA President's Award for Research. Her publications include Locating Urban Conflicts, The Struggles for Jerusalem's Holy Places, violent infrastructures, places of conflict, and justice as the urban everyday. She is a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge. Emma DiNapoli is a human rights lawyer. She studied law at JD from Columbia Law School and holds a BA in English Literature and Religious Studies from the University of Virginia. Emma has written extensively on post-conflict justice and law reform, international human rights and humanitarian law, and she has previously worked on human rights issues in Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Sudan, among other places. Please help me welcoming this speaker.
Great, well thanks everyone for coming. It's so wonderful to see some familiar faces and lots of new faces. I really appreciate your time and for spending it with me, and thank you to Azadeh, Catalina, and also Barbara for inviting us here today and hosting us. Really appreciate it. Now, on every Arabic book that I've had when I've been learning Arabic, I always put Inna Allah ma'a sabirin. Right? God is with the patient. And this has also been the story of this book. So this book started actually from the devastating scenes of Yarmouk and the obliteration and systematic destruction of that camp. That many of you may be familiar with the images of that. And that resulted in me kind of searching for a concept within my discipline of urban geography to think like how I can understand this rubberization of an entire urban neighborhood and district. And it was the concept of urbicide that basically made most sense to me to try and think through. And Martin Coward has done some very important work in relation to Bosnian conflict around urbicide that was really defined as the destruction of pluralism and heterogeneity, and the deliberate destruction of the built environment. And in Beyond the Square, Urbanism, the Arab Uprising, that published in 2016, so I really tried to think through this concept of urbicide. And it just became apparent that destruction, and now also carrying on this conversation with Martin and this growing literature, unfortunately, on urbicide, given the Israeli genocide in Gaza and urbicide, and of course Ukraine and other devastating urban conflicts that's resulted in the proliferation and use of this idea, has increasingly in 2016 tried to struggle with the fact that we, in the urban studies realm, and more broadly, haven't got a strong conceptual grasp of how to understand urban conflict. I would like, as a good academic, to put a footnote here and just also say how honoured I am that Wendy is also joining us, because I think Wendy's done some really groundbreaking and important work herself, but also in the cohort that she has created at Cambridge, and many of that group have created things like Arab Urbanism, which is a collective that Ammar and I are both a part of, and I hope everyone here interested in the intersection of the Arab world and urbanisation knows about it, and they're equally doing very important work in relation to the topic we're discussing today and beyond. But in that 2016 piece, it became apparent to me that the deliberate destruction of the built environment is only one component of urbicide. And so I defined urbicide as, on one spectrum, it involves destruction, but also construction, and then all of these processes in between these two poles, which could be issues of rubble removal, which is what I go into in certain aspect of my contribution to Reconstruction as violence, the way that the temporal aspects of rubble removal can be weaponized by a malign regime trying to punish certain civilian populations, urban sieges, which of course were used frequently in the course of the Syrian conflict, and the withdrawal of basic urban services, water, electricity, and of course mobility through urban conflicts, which has also led to other work related to urban violence, thinking through how concrete and cement and other materials become part of the weaponization of the urban realm. So the idea here is that it's not only urban destruction that we need to look at, but urban violence is involved. Sieges, the denial of the city and basic urban services, looting, and the complex issues around things such as road. So from 2016, this kind of work expanded, and in 2018, Nasser Rabbat at MIT kindly invited me to join as a postdoc, and we organised a conference in 2019, which is the root of this book, and then a conference that was Reconstruction as Violence, focused on, in part, Aleppo, but it always depends on the various contributors that you're able to gather in these, and many of the contributors also joined later. So this book has, as I said, been a long journey that began in 2019, and right at the last, unfortunately, I can't share a copy with you, because the wonderful thing, of course, of the fall of the Assad regime did mean that we had to make a bit of a change, not only to the title, but some rapid updates in the introduction, which meant that, unfortunately, for now, you can't see the book, but it will be out in August. You've just got to wait a little bit longer. The aim of the book was to take construction and planning seriously in context of an act of war. So to shift away, actually, this initial focus that I had on this shock of the rubble and destruction of Yarmouk, but then actually to take seriously throughout a book and a systematic analysis of construction and planning in war. That is the central aim of this book. And then to think, of course, of construction, then you have to really confront this huge term throughout contemporary history of reconstruction. And then, of course, in the development of this book, there was the seismic earthquake that happened in February of 2023 that devastated large parts of northeastern Syria, which again made us take account of how this book fits in. Yeah.
Northwest.
Sorry?
Northwest.
Northwest, sorry, did I say northeast? Yeah, northwest. And the political earthquake of December 8th, 2024, that resulted in the end of 53 years of the Assad regime's rule. So the challenges to, of course, the new Syrian interim government are immense. I think everyone will be familiar with the sizable challenges that this regime faces, and the current moment that I think it's fair to say is in flux, and everyone's in a kind of wait and see mode. But then at the same time, of course, reconstruction is an urgent need across Syria's ravaged urban context. And now I think the book really stands as a historic testament to what's happened under the Assad regime in context of rebuilding and reconstruction, and how it's been weaponized, and a quite detailed catalogue of what not to do, and a warning. And the other key element that stresses again and again that reconstruction requires social engagement. It requires an analysis, an understanding, and a contextualization of political, historical, economic, and social factors. That process is absolutely key in the reconstruction to ensure that it is indeed politically engaged, historically informed, and socially just. It's a warning and a message that, of course, is more relevant than ever. And this book offers a historically grounded account of Syria that emphasizes and details the country's deep pluralism, and one that also privileges Syrian contributors and voices. So Nasser Rabbat, in his opening account, really provides this deep historical overview of the intricate and diverse Syrian mosaic, as he calls it, that is layered from the conquest of Alexander the Great and the entry of the Arabized tribes in the 1st century BC to the contemporary pluralism that defines modern Syria. That, of course, Rabbat argues that any understanding and taking account of Syria's historical mosaic is necessary for any reconstruction attempt today. That there is a need to consider the causes, extent, and consequences of the destruction with a full awareness of this longue durée history behind it. What will be reconstructed, and more importantly, what reality is to be reconstructed? And what constitutes heritage? Whose heritage? Of course, are complex and intricate questions. And Hegna Bottenpod, in her contribution, traces the complex twists and turns of heritage classification in Aleppo, cautioning of that the process of taking old things and turning them into cultural heritage is always one entangled in power. And Ammar, in his chapter as well, gives this ground-up account of one reconstruction discourse in the case of Homs, but also what people treasure on an everyday basis compared to what is often highlighted by international media or agencies and the world. In the case of Bottenpol, the association of the restoration of Aleppo's historic core with the Assad regime and the urban inequities it produced cannot be ignored in any consideration of any reconstruction effort. So one of the principal questions we address in the book is what is reconstruction and how is it related to conflict? And there is this broader conceptual tension on how the term reconstruction has been understood and framed. And collectively, the essays in this book dispel any simple or direct connection between reconstruction and the start of a post-conflict era. Reconstruction and peace processes can intersect, but they don't necessarily intersect. They are two independent processes. And I think part of the effort here is to ensure that they intersect through making them politically informed, historically, economically, and socially. So as part of this retooling, there's an extensive engagement with the book over the concept of urbicide and its application to the Syrian conflict and war. Emma, who will also be talking to us today, gives the examples around the legal regimes of what she's termed herbicidal reconstruction under the Assad regime. And there's also cognate terms like domicide that Ammar will be talking about. And Omar Farouati, who unfortunately can't be with us today because he's in Syria, uses this idea of civilian crisis architecture that is used to bring us closer to the everyday architectural practices of civilians trying to survive the ravages of war. So reconstruction is a political, social, and historical process, and it needs to be engaged as such. The focus on reconstruction as violence is aimed at ensuring that reconstruction's efforts are directed towards a just, community building, and decolonial approach. Reconstruction as liberation that can resist any attempt to impose a reconstruction as violence or revenge.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here, and it's rather interesting to be at a book launch for a book that nobody's read. But for the most part, you're going to have to use your imaginations. I think this issue of this major change with the fall of Assad is very interesting, though, because what it means in terms of the book, in terms of a lot of other things as well, is that there's enough of a break that we can actually start to look at the situation and begin to say what happened, which I don't think we were able to do nearly so well. And I realized, just going over my own contribution, that for this event here, my ability to say what happened is probably much better today than it was when I wrote this. So it's certainly an interesting process. I wrote my piece as really part of a trilogy of work that the first one was ostensibly to look at urbicide and to try and pull it apart and understand better what the components were of herbicide. That as important as the work we have from people like Stephen Graham and Martin Coward and so on, I felt that there were a lot of missing pieces there. So I started with that. Actually, this piece on Syria was the second one, but I then did a third piece on Ukraine. And I realized in looking at these three, and the herbicide piece and the Ukrainian piece have been published now. I realized that in looking at it, that the question really has much more to do with the nature of what we understand as post-conflict, which I think is extremely problematic. In fact, I really got to the point some time ago already to say that post-conflict probably doesn't exist. That we live in a situation where there is a lot of continuity and an intermingling between conflict and whatever else you want to call it, lack of violence, peace, harmony. I mean, it's pretty hard to say at this point what that might be. But as the term post-conflict becomes more and more used, I think it becomes more and more problematic. Now, Reconstruction obviously plays a major role in that question of post-conflict. But I think that the bigger issue really has to do with trying to understand conflict and then ultimately post-conflict. And that's just it's deeper and more widespread. Now, my interest in that, I think, probably goes back to a small book I read by W.G. Sebald. Now, those of you who know Sebald will know him in a literary context. I mean, he primarily wrote fiction. He was a German who, after the war, moved to the UK, and he spent most of his life in the UK. But he wrote a very slim little book called On the Natural History of Destruction. That's not so well known. And he looks at the destruction of German cities. And you have to remember, this is Sebald, who's already living in the UK, so it's an interesting vantage point. And he says that we do not grasp what it actually meant. And at one point, he's talking about the city of Worms, and he says they make it look as if the image of total destruction was not the horrifying end of a collective aberration, but something more like the first stage of a brave new world. Now, he wrote that in 1997, and I have to say, it really nagged at me. I mean, that was before we were talking about herbicide very much. Really, most of these issues were not commonly part of our discussions. But that question, and his impressions of what had happened to the cities in Germany was something that kind of nagged at me, and I think probably led to the interest finally in post-conflict. And because I think that the tendency has always been to divorce Reconstruction from the destruction itself. And actually what happens when there is that divorce, when there is that separation, it probably puts Reconstruction into a much more radical position than it would be if it was linked to the destruction. Certainly in the years that we've, in our group, have worked on the nature of urban conflict, I mean, one of the things that we've certainly realized is that conflict is something that it's almost cycles of being less violent and being more violent, sometimes peacefulness, sometimes not. Populations respond in ways that are reflective of those situations. And the idea that there is that break is of course something that really doesn't make sense when you have this constant ebb and flow of more and less violence. Now, of course, some cities have much more violence and are unfortunate in that situation. Others, we think, are able to deal with conflict in a reasonably constructive way. And one of the things we don't understand very well at this point really is why that's happening, and why some cities have a much more difficult time than others. In this book, my chapter focused on some discussion of these issues, and then I tried to look at Syrian cities in three different ways that would help enlighten us a little bit on what was going on. So I have three sections. The first one is called, and obviously I don't have time to really go into this, but hopefully we'll eventually get the book and read it. But, I mean, the first one is called War by Destruction. And in a way, that's the most obvious thing, that there's been a tremendous amount of destruction. I think that what you see, though, when you start to study it, that it's very, very complete in terms of cities. I mean, the focus has been on the cities, and that the amount of destruction is not simply in terms of individual buildings. A lot of the aid agencies and NGOs, political groups, and so on, put a lot of emphasis on the destruction of infrastructures, and I mean, yes, that is certainly a problem. But it's very much an urban phenomenon. And that we see different modes and different scales of destruction. And it all comes together in this way that we can say is urban. So it's a matter of buildings, of streets, of institutions, of demographies. I mean, all of those different things that suffer various levels of destruction. I mean, just one very quick example that I'd like to give you just to show what I mean. The use of barrel bombs in Syrian cities. The kind of destruction that the barrel bombs caused had to do very much with the facades of the buildings. And so that we get many, many streets where the facades are obliterated. And I think we've all seen news footage where you see the facade of the building just wiped away. And so you get this situation where you're looking into people's houses. And that very peculiar reversal between what is public and what is private. You know, where all of a sudden the most private parts of the houses are on view for the whole world as they become part of news footage. And this sense that the street, though, at the same time loses its context, and it loses all of its capacity to really to be a public place because it's being destroyed. And that kind of disruption of what I would call the urban order there, I mean, being public or private, is a very, very important part of urban order. That sort of destruction and really obliteration is something that's very, very hard to put back together again. So, all right, war by destruction is one way of, you know, how is this happening? You know, what can we say at this point in looking back? The second thing I wrote about was war by narrative. Because I think one of the things that we tend to forget when we're looking at buildings and streets and neighborhoods and all of that sort of thing is that actually there's a story behind all of this. And there are people telling stories. Whether they're true or not is another matter, but there's lots of stories being told about what's going on. Now, one of the big stories that I found was a speech by Assad from 2017. And this was a speech that he made to the Foreign Service of Syria. So it was an interesting speech in that it was meant for domestic consumption, but he was talking about these issues that he was interested in to people who were going to take it abroad. So it was a very, very important speech. And again, just a very brief quote that I think, well, I thought it was shocking when I first read it. I still am shocked by it. Where he says, "We have lost the best of our young people and an infrastructure that has cost us a lot of money and sweat over several generations. But in return, we have gained a healthier and more harmonious society. This harmony is at the foundation of national cohesion. And to reinforce this, the cohesion of society as we see it today is our reality today." I mean, that is a terrible statement. And I don't know, I mean, we may be a little bit more seasoned to that sort of thing because we're sitting and listening to Trump every day. But it was certainly something that was prescient in that sense, that at that point he could say anything he wanted. And the truth didn't matter, but the story mattered a lot. That the narrative made a very, very big difference, and that, you know, we live our lives around stories. And so that was important. The third section has to do with war by reconstruction. That is probably the most obvious part of how victory can be achieved through manipulation, which is political, it's economic, it's certainly demographic, and it also has to do with security. I mean, other people in the book have written in more detail than I have about reconstruction, and I think that's one of the great strengths of the book. Actually, is a lot of the discussion about how the reconstruction is so poorly placed in terms of speaking for Syria. So, I mean, the question of bulldozing Ashwiyat, the plans from Marotan and Hom's dreams, and I mean, you know, various planned neighborhoods. What really happens with this is, I think it sets the scene for further conflict. That these are set up as bastions for certain members of the population, not for others. And they are set up with very, very high levels of security and control. And so it becomes a recipe really for future disasters. And that is the part of the story that probably many of us know, but it is the really devastating outcome of all of this. So, I mean, there's a lot that I can say about the problems of the notion of post-conflict that I think we all really need to be reassessing. But at this point, I mean, I think I can say that there is no closure with it. As much as it's conveyed to us as a form of closure, I don't think it's there. That there's cycles of violence and peacefulness. Often the reconstruction, of course, is there in order to cover some of the really hideous events of the past, and sometimes the very recent past. One of the things that I haven't talked about, but I do go into in the article, is the relationship between the city and the state. That reconstruction is always left up to the state, but it's actually the city that requires the reconstruction. That's where the populations are, that's where people know about their cultures, and a lot of even more complex issues that are mostly political, how the state is very, very concerned about unity. I mean, we hear that every day right here in the UK. You know, are we unified or not? But on the other hand, the city is never seen as any sort of bastion of unity at all, but the city is probably more inclusive than the state. So there's a whole discussion to be had there between state and city. And also at this point, I would say that it's very, very important to remember that Reconstruction is dominated by the nature of the conflict itself, and that must not be forgotten. And I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And it's interesting that you should mention the 2017 speech, because it was repeated throughout the contributors of this discussion. I had to, as an editor, edit down and say we can't repeat this speech too many times throughout the book, but it is good that you've picked it out, because it was such a powerful moment, and it's something that we're going to return to when we speak with Sawsan. And narrative is also a really, as you said, powerful element to this, and there's no more powerful element that when it comes to narrative, whether something is legal or not. And of course we've seen this with the genocide debates in terms of what is determined as a genocide is done through a legal frame rather than perhaps even a moral or ethical one. The law carries such an incredible power, and that is something that Emma now is going to turn to in her contribution to the book. Yeah.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks, Wendy, and thanks everyone who's here today. By way of introduction, I became interested in the topic of herbicidal reconstruction, or war by legal means, when I was working for a human rights organization in Lebanon with Syrian refugees who were being evicted from their homes in Lebanon, and then consequently being functionally, although not necessarily, pushed back to Syria. And this was in 2018, and at the time a law that I'll speak briefly about and talk more about in the book, number 10, had just been passed, which had significant consequences for people's ability to return to their homes or claim their property. And so I began thinking about the concept of property and how it functions in the wartime context then, and have been really lucky to be a part of this project. I'll talk sort of in simple terms about what I write in the book, and before diving into the specifics of the Syrian conflict, I'll make just a few very basic points about the relationship between property and power, and forgive me, of course, if you've already heard this and thought about this. But property is typically or colloquially thought of as the absolute ownership of an object. So, the ability to use something, to manage it, to sell it, to possess it. But property is also really critically a relationship between individuals and the state. And some conventional thinking suggests that the establishment of exclusive, private property rights is key to, for example, alleviating widespread poverty, because the sovereign ownership of property would allow the poor broader access to the capital market, and so on. And in some cases, this process of capitalization does really work. It has the desired effect. But in my view, the belief that property rights are kind of key to the exercise of individual freedom is both overly simplistic and pretty ahistorical. In fact, securing private property rights for one party often entails the dispossession of another party, and it imposes new hierarchies between individuals that are mediated by the state. So the state plays a very critical role in this, and their private property rights are thus fundamentally relational. In some cases, for many of us, perhaps, the relationship between us and the state, as seen through property, is a benign relationship, and even positive. But in the context of conflict, and as many authors, not just me, discuss in the book, this process can be really ruinous for individuals and should be seen as an extension of war. And so this is what I talk about in the book as a process of herbicidal reconstruction that is fundamentally legal. The process of capitalization can often happen outside of the context of war. And so in normal capitalist urbanization, you have powers of exercised through zoning ordinances or the powers of eminent domain. And in the context of natural disasters, this often happens. So after a tsunami, for example, or a hurricane, You'll have what other people call regimes of exception established, whereby property developers or others are given broad authority to rebuild cities outside of normal planning processes, so much more quickly, with more carte blanche. The reconstruction process that happens after war, or even during war, as we see in Syria, is not that dissimilar in some ways to what happens after a tsunami in terms of the kind of scale of destruction that you might see. But what's distinct about what happens in an herbicidal conflict versus after a tsunami is that the process is neither unforeseen or unavoidable when it happens in the context of conflict, but was actually an intentional outcome. So in my chapter, I argue that one of the goals of an herbicidal war is precisely to effect the reorganization of property rights with two complementary objectives. The first is to prevent the formation of durable property rights, which would be accessible to large swaths of the city's population, which has the result, of course, of foreclosing the possibility of their meaningful return. And this is groups such as former political opponents, for example, or minorities. And the second objective is to redistribute those assets through a legal process to political allies and private capital, whose interests are also aligned. And I would argue that this process is a new form of enclosing the commons, which is underwritten by an overlapping set of regulatory tools. And I go into this in greater detail in the book, and I won't do too much of that today, but I think it's important to say that this process is or was underway in Syria, at least before late December of last year. And that in Syria there were several preconditions that made this process possible, so by which I mean herbicidal reconstruction by legal means. Of course, the destruction, the widespread physical destruction was a precondition. But also, land and property grievances significantly predate the war. So Syria has no centralized national level property registry, and no records created before 2010 have been digitized. So when property registers were destroyed in the war, the actual registers were destroyed. And prior to the war, in areas such as Damascus, between 40 and 50% of residents lived in unregistered settlements with no formal titles and consequently no security of tenure. And forgive me for the history lesson here, but this has not escaped the notice of the Syrian regime. So you had, from the 1950s, property and land were a real focus of attention for the Syrian regime. Major land reforms in the 1950s, for example, resulted in the expropriation of more than 1 million hectares of land and limited the amount of land an individual could own. And then subsequent reforms in the next 2 decades introduced increasingly stringent restrictions against specific kinds of landowners. During this period, and I think another author talks about this as well, the government began using what it called 5-year development plans, which were in part to enable public-private partnerships, which resulted in the sale of huge tracts of land to regime-aligned contractors. And then in the 1990s and early 2000s, so fast forwarding a bit, the government had taken a sharp turn towards neoliberalism and began really properly using legislative decrees and laws to incentivize the development of large-scale luxury developments, which, as you can imagine, pushed ordinary Syrians to the edges of the city, and this happens, of course, in other cities too. And so the point of this is both to show, the discussion in the chapter is to show the Syrian government has been interested in land, and that it had used decrees and laws and regulations to really increase its coercive power, even before the outbreak of the war. And that so the measures that we saw during the war actually weren't necessarily a break from the past, but were actually reflected a great deal of continuity from the pre-war legal status quo, but just kind of a deepening of what we had seen, or an intensification. So I guess to summarize that discussion, it was just to say that the property rights system has long been weaponized in Syria against the country's urban poor and towards authoritarianism. Which brings me then to the third section of the chapter. I think I'm probably a bit short in time already, so I won't extensively describe the laws, but the government, beginning in 2012 at least, began passing a raft of laws that permitted demolitions in designated areas, prohibited any kind of informal construction, which was very common, and authorized the redevelopment of areas of informal settlement. Decree number 66 was in 2012, and that was a kind of early indicator of the government's strategic interest in beginning to assert even greater control over urban planning. This decree allowed for the redevelopment of areas of unauthorized housing and informal settlements in Damascus in particular. And the then Prime Minister described the decree as the, quote, first step in the reconstruction of illegal housing areas, especially those targeted by armed terrorist groups, end quote. And of course, it's no surprise that the areas targeted by armed terrorist groups were almost exclusively occupied by regime opponents who had been targeted for mass evictions even before the war began, including under an unimplemented development plan, or 2007 urban plan for Damascus, so one of those development plans that we spoke about before. And this story held true across Syria's other cities. Wendy mentioned the Marota city development, which is an infamous development, a multi-million-dollar project that's on the outskirts of Damascus. This was conceived before the war began, and then was actually initiated under the auspices of a 2015 decree, which allowed additional public-private partnerships for reconstruction. Other laws, including Law 10, which was the law that I mentioned, hearing about from Syrian refugees in Lebanon, required Syrians to make claims of ownership to property within 30 days. This was later amended in November of the same year to allow Syrians to make claims within a year to property. But of course, many Syrians who weren't in Syria lacked the ability to make formal claims demonstrating ownership, or lacked sufficient paperwork because they didn't actually have a formal deed, like we talked about, due to the lack of formal tenure. So, absent such a claim, the land could be redistributed at will, and there were other laws that mirrored this but differed slightly in the way that they were constructed. And wealthy Syrians and foreign allies were generally the beneficiaries of these measures. And I guess I want to emphasize that they were legal, because they were, doesn't mitigate their herbicidal purpose and effect. And the effect, again, just to restate, was to ensure the permanence of Syria's demographic changes. And so that's sort of what I set out in the chapter. I'll just make one more point. I think, there are now opportunities to undo this process, and that would be, of course, the wholesale amendment of the laws and regulations that allow for this kind of herbicidal reconstruction. But I think history shows us that this process is not easy. This isn't a perfect example, but after the herbicidal conflict in Bosnia, and I think that's kind of the original, or one of the original examples of herbicide that is referenced, the international community helped establish a property restitution mechanism that had a pretty straightforward mandate and actually was reasonably well resourced. But despite that, restitution efforts broadly failed to incentivize return of millions displaced. And the context in Syria is, of course, different in terms of ability to return and this sort of thing. But I think it's important to note that that specific restitution mechanism really more or less reified or exacerbated some of the ethnic divisions that underrode the original conflict. And in the end, only 75% of returned property, so that property returned under the restitution mechanism, was actually sold or exchanged once again, often from the hands of minority owners to majority owners, often under really discriminatory or coercive conditions, and sometimes outright unsafe conditions. So in the end, what happened was that communities in which a substantial amount or percentage of property had been nominally returned to its previous owners or occupants eventually still underwent significant demographic changes and giving rise to ethnic antagonisms that I think we can see in Bosnia even now. And so I offer this just to say that the international community should be aware of these kind of historical examples and learn some lessons from contexts in which property destruction was widespread and intentional. And I think the task before us, and I don't actually have an answer to how we do this, is just to ensure that the state of exception that has been established through the various laws and regulations enacted in Syria since 2011 are not permitted to function as a kind of permanent state of governance. I meant to keep in mind that the urbicidal thrust of the war, so that Reconstruction is not just, as you say, a kind of politically neutral activity, because that would be a mistake. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Let's please our next speakers come on board. Thank you very much, Wendy and Emma, for your contribution. I'm sure after we're going to have time to engage also with questions and answers with everyone. But I'm very happy to welcome our own Sawsan, Abou, Zainedin. So please come have a seat. She's a Syrian architect and urban development planner. She was with us for so many years here. Her work addresses the spatial manifestations of conflict through research and practice with a focus on the political, socioeconomic, and technical challenges of urban development and reconstruction in Syria. She's a co-founding director of Sawsan Housing Communities, a non-profit social enterprise for developing inclusive and socially just housing programs to aid recovery in Syria. Sawsan holds an urban development planning master from the Bartlett Development Planning Unit. So, we're very proud to see you.
Very proud to be back.
She also holds a postgraduate diploma in integrated planning and urban strategies from the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies at Erasmus University and an architecture BSc from University of Aleppo. And we're very happy also to have Ammar Azzouz with us. We love his work. He was also very generous to be with us in an event that we hold in November around urbicide with an exceptional lineup of speakers across the Middle East. And your insights were very useful for us to get grips of what is happening at the moment. And of course, we're not in a vacuum. This is a very tumultuous time as we speak. So I think we all also have to hold this heavy heart that we are having at the moment. So I just want to acknowledge that we are in a very contentious moment. So just having you here is also very important. We're not taking for granted also the efforts, and to be here and able to speak and embrace and discuss these issues is now more crucial than ever. So Ammar Azzouz is a British Academy Research Fellow at the University of Oxford. He's the author of Domicide, Architecture, War and Destruction of Home in Syria, published by Bloomsbury in 2023, with a foreword by Liz Doucet, the BBC Chief International Correspondent. This book is actually... he's currently conducting research on Syrian art and culture in exile, with a focus on the post-revolutionary art. Azzouz has written for a wide range of platforms, including the New York Times, Financial Times, and The Guardian. So we're very happy to have you here, and really eager to hear from you now that you were able to visit and be back here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to switch up the format a bit and make it a bit more conversational. And of course, we've got two incredible Syrians with us who represent, I think, the best of all of us, not just Syria. And Sawsan has been doing amazing work with Madania, and I think even Mona just came up before, and we're all in awe of Mona Fawaz at AUB, and also commenting on just the really profound and important work that Sawsan is doing as CEO of Madania, which is a Syrian-led and funded initiative that is trying to reclaim the Syrian political agency that has otherwise, in the Assad era, been systematically decimated for all sorts of reasons, and we will get into that in this discussion. And Ammar, who you've probably seen on TV, has been doing incredible work, writing commentaries, giving a real view at a ground level as to what Syrians have been discussing and thinking about in terms of...
But not reality TV.
Big Brother, watch out. Yeah. But as I mentioned earlier, and Wendy was citing this speech in 2017 is where I wanted to start, because it was, as I mentioned, something that many of the contributors to this book grabbed onto, and it's also a speech that Sawsan starts her chapter on. And it's interesting, though, that Wendy actually translated it as harmonious or homogeneous, the Arabic being
تجانس.
تجانس.
مجتمع أكثر تجانس. Yeah.
And that was the speech that you started your chapter on. So maybe if you could explain why that speech was such a critical one in that moment, and then the instances of urbicide that you unpack in the chapter.
Thanks, Dean. I'm really very pleased to be here. This place is like home to me, and to be able to go back and discuss this is on another level. But to your question, I think, so the fall of Aleppo came at the very end of 2016. It was in December 2016. And I think the fall of Aleppo is a moment in the Syrian conflict that shaped the dynamics afterwards in one way or another. And this very speech of Bashar al-Assad came afterwards. As Emma said, in that speech, Bashar al-Assad was giving the speech at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriate, and it was in the context of inviting investments for reconstruction. So in the second half of that part where he says we've lost the best of our infrastructure and of our youth, but in return we've gained a healthier and more, I call it homogenized society. He also said it's time now that we open the door for investment so that we rebuild the country. So I think what is very, what stands out in here is that this was the foundation that Bashar al-Assad used to call for the beginning of a new era, and an era where investment is called in the country to start the post-conflict phase and the reconstruction of Syria. Although in practice, it was only the fall of Aleppo that followed the fall and forced eviction of multiple other urban enclaves inside the country, and that was later also followed by that. But I think the fall of Aleppo was very important in the entire narrative of the Syrian conflict, because it was the incident through which the Assad military strategies materialized, and we would now, looking back, see that these were indeed strategies that they were practiced against areas that have witnessed the rebellion in one way or another. So starting from the disturbance of the life and the flows and the orders and the systems that form an urban environment, and I'll come to this later. You've touched a little bit on that, Wendy, and then followed by destruction, so the use of actual weapons, be it the barrel bombs, going all the way to prohibited weapons, chemical weapons, etc. Meanwhile, enforcing sieges on cities, so making sure that mobility, food, aid is absolutely restricted, and then coming to the people to negotiate a reconciliation agreement in which they would either surrender and leave altogether, or reconcile in the sense that they would just, reintegrate themselves in the Assad kind of definition of an urban space. And this strategy is something that was presented and I think concluded also through the eviction of Aleppo, and then we've seen it unfold later on, particularly in eastern Ghouta and the northern countryside of Homs, and other suburbs of Damascus that would still, but it also defined a new geopolitical order inside Syria, because from that moment on, after that, it was the regime-held area, that very big, solid geography that's absolutely controlled by the Assad regime, and then we had 3 other enclaves supposedly, governed by the opposition. I would call it different de facto authorities, different military de facto authorities. There's a very famous slogan in Syria that became very public at the very beginning of the revolution in 2011. It says, Al-Assad أو نحرق البلد. Assad or we burn down the country. And that was a very famous slogan. So when I think of that 2017 speech of Bashar al-Assad, I immediately think that in a way, this speech was Assad's implicit acknowledgement of how he put this slogan to practice. Literally, Al-Assad أو نحرق البلد. So all the geographies, the cities, the areas, the neighborhoods, the enclaves that dreamt of identifying themselves with something other than Assad had to face the exact same strategies. I was editing an issue for Al Jumhuriya, a Syrian magazine, on militarizing the urbanism. It was right after you wrote your piece, Deen, for Beyond the Square on urbicide. And it was actually your framework that you presented on urbicide that made me feel, that actually made me able to make sense of what was going inside Syria as a war of homogenization, because that was exactly what you referred to. And it would be interesting for you also to engage in this conversation I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on this. But you talked about how herbicides can take destructive forms and reconstruction or constructive, I can't maybe call it constructive, but forms that would engage with construction activities and all that comes in between, which is the urban flows, the systems, the orders, the mobility of the people, of the commodities, of the energy, of water, of what we consume, of what makes our everyday life. And it was reading your definition of herbicide that suddenly it was the final piece in the puzzle for me to put together, to make sense really of that devastating and very violent war that the Assad regime waged against its own people, using the built environment as means for it and as tools. And so this is why I wanted to start my chapter with that, just to make sure that we acknowledge that what was taking place was very was orchestrated. It was a strategy. It was driven by a reason to actually homogenize and create a unit that is easier to rule by this regime. It was not, the entire war, this entire nearly 15 years of Syrian war was not something that was, that unfolded as a result of events that kept escalating and escalating. I really think that it was an orchestrated strategy that got implemented in different locations, and that can be seen in the slogan "La Asad ونحرق البلد" that defined the entire response of the Syrian regime, and not concluded with that 2017 speech speaking of homogeneity.
Great, thanks, Sawsan. And I think, also what Ammar, your work, brings to this is through the use of domicide rather than herbicide. Like, from me, that everyday and intimate connection that sometimes in herbicide, when we're talking about, the construction and destruction and then things in between of basic urban services, mobility, but it does lack that kind of intimacy and personal touch that when you talk about domicide and the home, you're giving that really intimate and personal connection. I mean, was that the intention when you're using that concept? And maybe you could expand how you came to domicide and what it gives you as an analytical lens.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and also thank you for Catalina and for the team, for UCL, for having us here. And I'm really also inspired by Professor Mona Fawaz, who's also here today, that I follow her work for many years, and many other colleagues who I follow their work here. So thank you so much for making the time. And also to link this struggle, this question of destruction of home with the wider debates in the region, I was looking at Google Maps and seeing we are very few hundreds of kilometers away from each other between Gaza and Beirut, between Beirut and Damascus, between Damascus and Mosul, between other cities that they are under same questions, only very few hundred kilometers between each other. So this question of destruction and reconstruction and violence, we sometimes like zoom in and look at my city, at my Homs, at Suwaida, at Beirut, but we should really, I hope, like we have a space where we can ask these questions together inside the region, but also beyond. Like I was today with my very dear friend to me, Jinia Gopkina, who wrote Being a Ukrainian Architect at the Time of Conflict, and so many similar questions on what do we do today, what's our role as an architect, what can I do as a teacher or as a PhD student, as a researcher in the face of this. And for me to answer your question about why I wanted to use this concept of domicide that refers to the deliberate killing of home or domus, because I felt in any war we hear about numbers and statistics. The UN has said a few days ago that more than 90% of the housing units have been destroyed in Gaza, which is more than 400,000 units that have been destroyed by Israel in one place, in Gaza, in a very short time. We hear the numbers. In the Syrian case, in my city, more than half of the city has been heavily destroyed in Homs, where I'm from, and around a quarter of it is partially destroyed. 1 out of 2 people in Syria are displaced, more than 14 million people in 14 years. This is larger than the population of Lebanon, for instance. It's imagine like a country on the move, More than half of the number is outside the country, mostly in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, like these neighboring countries and beyond. But 6.5 million Syrians are internally displaced, sometimes as many as 25 times, because the front lines keeps shifting and keeps moving and their living conditions keep changing. So what I have seen in the Syrian case, in the time when we were writing the book and in a time when I was thinking about what could be done, is that we became really like a faceless war, like a war without a face, a war without a voice, without a humanity, without emotions, and we only see the numbers that the UN reports, the news what they are telling the story, and from now and then we hear about the numbers of buildings destroyed. So I wanted to use this concept of domicide as a way to see what does it mean to lose home for the people, and what does it mean to write a history of the people who have lost their home, what's the grief they are experiencing, what are their emotions, how do they navigate the city in these times, and this is how I arrived to using the concept. There's another reason why I chose this, because I felt that Syria was, if we can say, like a fashionable conflict site. It's a wrong word to use, but this was the case in comparison, let's say, to the war in Sudan or Yemen or Libya. And therefore, everyone jumped into looking at this fashionable conflict because it was this attractive conflict, similar to Ukraine, for instance. But at the same time, there was little engagement with the Syrians, the people who wouldn't, let's say, know the context or talk to the Syrians right on our behalf. And therefore, I felt also in writing about the people and the city, a way to reclaim, like as Wendy said, it's about the narrative as well. So what does it mean to redirect the narrative when everyone's jumping on the Syrian, let's say, story, but without listening to the local voices and the local people? And also I felt that in the war in Syria, when we hear a lot about the destruction of Palmyra, the ancient cultural heritage sites, and there was like a global lament on, losing like an ancient heritage. And of course for Western elites, they, as Lynn Meskel writes in her book, A Future in Ruins, she says that the Western elites would feel like they are legitimate to protect, or they feel like part of that classic antiquity in Syria and the region, that the monuments that are thousands of years old, but without caring about the destruction of the everyday life. So for me, I wanted to make this move, this shift of conversation from focusing on the monument towards like thinking about the everyday life. So these are just some of the reflections that I had, and I wanted to collect like narratives from people in order to tell a story of what it means to lose home and what it means to build a home.
And you went back to Syria for the first time in 14 years.
Yeah.
So how was it going back? And you also presented your work at the University of Damascus. Can you give us a sense of, one, what it was like to go back, and also I'm assuming you had these discussions that you've been working on directly in Syria and in Homs, your hometown, and what reaction you got also in presenting your work?
Yeah. So for me, I was displaced like millions of Syrians. I left the country in 2011 and I have never been able to return since then. I came to the UK without my family. I came by myself. and I was only able to return this March for 40 days, and it really felt like going to where the world has ended and where it began again, because you walk in entire neighborhoods and they are razed completely to the ground. So you really feel like that was, if we imagine the end of the world, this is how it felt to walk in Baba Ammar or in Al Khaldiya or in Jurat Shayyah or in many other neighborhoods inside Homs. That's how it felt to arrive to the end of the world. But you walk and talk to the people, and even when people, like an academic in Homs University, working for the university, the government university, they earn $120 per month. Even when people have really extreme living conditions, they still would ask you, would you like to have a coffee with me? Can I invite you for a dinner? Can I have you for food? So what I want to say that despite the fact that the world feels like as if it has ended there, it's really like, the resilience, not resilience, but like the people survival and their generosity and kindness still is there. To present in Homs and in Damascus, so in both universities, it was like a dream, because I haven't been there for 14 years, and all the questions that I was asking from far away, we look at Google Maps, at satellite images, but suddenly you are there asking the questions when they matter. And it was also a learning curve for me to learn, about what's important today. So I remember an academic told me that all the reconstruction today is about talking, and we want, people are struggling to count their bread pieces. So sometimes even for me as a researcher, I would be thinking, what can I do today? When people are living in extreme living conditions, what's the value of my research, and how can I transfer this research into something practical? Because it is the moment now. But at the same time, I shouldn't be shy about saying this. I did have this internal voice of myself saying that you are also becoming an outsider, because I remember somebody who said to me, like, talking about another person, they said, this person has not lived one bullet, and they are now back. So there's this, in any different diaspora, in any conflict, in any war, in any circumstances, there's this inside-outside, and what it means to be relevant there, what it means to do something meaningful, even though I lived there most of, like, 2/3 of my life, but I haven't lived the struggle that they lived. And all these questions, about like, who am I, what am I doing, what's the value of it, have become like all very important, but also helping me to reshift what I'm thinking of in regards of my research.
And Sawsan, I'm sure that everything that Ammar just said is pretty at the forefront of what you're having to deal with in engaging with civil society and with Madaniya. And I think everyone in this room would be interested to hear about what you're doing as the CEO of Madaniya, and to talk about many of the issues that Ammar just raised.
Sure. Madaniya is a collective of Syrian civil society organizations. We're over 240 organizations today. And this is not even a quarter of the number of the civil society organizations and NGOs that have emerged throughout the years of conflict in Syria. And this, we can engage with this number from different perspectives. In one side, it's a testimony to the efforts that Syrians wanted to put together to be able to navigate the conflict and what emerged out of it, because the conflict was protracted. Entire governorates and regions and cities have gone completely outside the control of the Syrian regime, and these areas were absolutely sustained and run by the efforts of civil society, of Syrian civil society, from the very top level of governance, of holding elections when elections were possible, to providing access to health services, education, whatever a municipality is responsible for, from waste collection, access to water, food, bakeries, etc., all the way to the perhaps more traditional work that civil society organizations would do in contexts related to human rights and accountability of those in power. with an added layer of all the violations that were taking place in an active conflict, there was much more to do in that front. So there are hundreds of absolutely over 1,000 of Assyrian civil society organizations that work inside the country, but also in exile, either in neighboring countries or in the diaspora. And as Ammar said, Syria was a very attractive conflict, but the agency of the Syrians themselves was not something that an outsider would engage with, not on a policy-making level, so speaking about the international community, stakeholders within the international community, all the way to other actors from the international NGO world or the international, the agencies of the UN, other mechanisms that wanted to engage in Syria. But most importantly, in relation to the political decision-making of the country, even with Assad withdrawing from certain geographies, these geographies were controlled by what we have called de facto authorities, military groups making political institutions to govern certain realities and using the efforts of the civil society to sustain their rule, but not in a way that would represent an alternative to why the Syrian revolution has started in the first place, so that Syrians can have a say in the way they live their lives and how their lives is being governed by those in power. So unfortunately, it was a complex disaster that Syrians were living despite the tremendous efforts of hundreds, if not thousands, of Syrian civil society actors. So the whole narrative around the Syrian conflict was eventually, after over a decade of war, reduced to Al-Assad versus other military groups, mostly jihadis or political groups who completely subordinate to Turkey. So it was a geopolitical, it was a conflict that was, brought into geopolitical dynamics, and the Syrian question, the struggle of the Syrians themselves for dignity, for a better future, completely dropped out of how we narrate this conflict. So when Madaniya was only established in 2022 and publicly launched in 2023, it was an attempt to reclaim this political agency, particularly in relation to the political decision-making on Syria, to the civic space that has done a lot in terms of service provision, giving life to entire areas, making sure that the cause is still alive and it's not just a military struggle amongst powerful military actors. So we're 240 organizations today, and those organizations work inside the country again and in the diaspora, but they also work in these different sectors, from organizations who work particularly on service provision to organizations such as the White Helmets, and we have Salah from the White Helmets. Sadly, if I can say, the White Helmets has dissolved itself now to reintegrate into the Ministry of Disaster and Emergencies. But the White Helmets is an example of one of these very big organizations we would still call civil society organizations that played fundamental role in the absence of governments, all the way to organizations who led significant efforts on human rights, on political engagement and empowerment, to grassroots organizations and voluntary groups. We're talking about not syndicates at this moment, because syndicates have, I think everybody identified syndicates as such a very critical unit of action in political struggles, and just like the Assad regime have absolutely co-opted the civic movement on that level, we can see that this has been reproduced by other de facto authorities and might again be reproduced in today's Syria. But there are multiple voluntary groups and associations, victims associations, professional associations, unions of students, etc., that have also joined Madaniya for this particular effort. Now, before the fall of the Assad regime, the mission was very clear. Reclaiming political agency starts with reaffirming the values of the revolution in terms of dignity, human rights, citizenship, and emphasizing the need for the collective effort to get there. the fall of the Assad regime was supposedly the bottleneck of this struggle. But it has never been the ultimate goal of the Syrian revolution. It was only the Syrian revolution, it was the revolution of dignity and freedom, ثورة الحرية والكرامة. So everybody took to the streets with the aim of getting there. Now with the Assad out of the picture, the struggle is supposed to be maintained until we get there. So it's a very interesting moment in life, and I would say when we were preparing for this, you asked me, Deen, whether I think homogenizing the fall of the Assad meant by nature the fall of the attempt to homogenize Syria, and I don't think so. And in fact, I think that the struggle is harder now because the opportunity is much bigger, and we can see it, and we can touch it, and we can feel it. And going back to Syria, as Ammar said, is a testimony to that. It was an overwhelming sense of justice that I felt when I got back to Syria after 10 years. It was literally a sense of justice because, and we're talking about the practices of urbicide, restricting mobility, the forced eviction of entire neighborhoods and populations out of their places, and then putting all the legal frameworks in place to prevent the return of those people in all shapes and forms. Now that we're back, it's a triumph over the acts of urbicide. It's a triumph over the strategy that Assad and his entire regime has put in place to deprive us of this feeling of being able to call a place home. We still have complications with calling it a home now, as Ammar said, with all the layers. But at least it's this struggle that we can see a huge opportunity for now. And we need to work on, but we need for that to be aware of all the acts of in your paper, in your framework of urbicide. I really liked what you in the description of that. You said what matters is what's at stake in the acts of urbicide, because the party that's practicing urbicide knows what to target, knows what's at stake. And in the Syrian conflict, it was not just the political affiliation what was at stake. The urbicide was practiced along sectarian lines, and I think Homs is a testimony to that. It was also practiced along socioeconomic lines, and we've seen that in some of what was branded as Reconstruction projects at the time, Marota and Basilia, but also Homs Dream, which is something that began even before the revolution in 2011, and even after that. If we look, so how the whole issue of informality was employed, and again, we leave it to reading the book, but there's a lot to engage with, and how the destruction maps in Homs in particular were nearly identical to that map of informal settlement, but they've also, overlapped with the former neighborhoods of the Homs Dream. So there are all of these lines, and speaking about narratives, they have all contributed to victimhood narratives in one way or another. So perhaps the louder of these can be the sectarian one now, but it's not the only narrative to be told. There's a lot to be told on discrimination on socioeconomic basis and on political basis, and how the entire legal framework have employed that. So now, I wouldn't call it post-conflict Syria, I would call it today's Syria, the Syria in the making. We have to be aware of all of these different layers, and how we think about reconstruction through a lens of transitional justice to actually deal with all of these layers and complexities of what's taking place over there. There was, even amongst the work of the civil society organization, there was tremendous focus on housing, land, and property rights. Now, focus on housing, land, property rights does not lead us to a better reconstruction process in the future. It's how we shift the narrative towards rights to housing and rights to land and rights to properties that would give us a chance at centralizing the social justice narrative when we work on reconstruction. So I'm just trying to go to explore more of the challenges that we're still facing ahead, to say that we still need our political agency as civic actors to move forward. We have a huge opportunity. We at least have an authority in place that we can engage with. We have a government that we can engage with that's trying to re-establish itself in the international community somehow after decades of being completely disconnected as Syrians. So there are opportunities, but there are also big threats and red flags that we have already seen 6 months into the new Syria. This whole tendency to engage with crony capitalists and to celebrate neoliberalism as you know the go-to, the solution to what's going on. This rush to investment and at the expense of engaging with what transitional justice means, and even from a perspective of urbanism. What does it mean? What does it mean for our cities that we're visiting for the first time with all the rubbles in place, etc.? So these are all the questions that we have to engage with moving forward. And as civil society, I think that there's a lot to unpack in here in terms of the narratives, in terms of the mentality of how we think about things, in terms of awareness about the multiple layers of victimhood that are on the rise today, and how, you know, there needs to be a place for everyone in Syria. There can be a place for everyone in Syria, but we're at a crossroads today where our actions can mean that, you know, we will only reproduce new layers of exclusion and of repression, and hence the work of Madaniya becomes crucial now. Does it, you know, it does come with its share of challenges for so many reasons. One of them, what you, Mona, referred to, and Ammar brought this into the conversation in our preparation, the Republic of NGOs. Yes, this is one big challenge that we have to, but it's also the war to come that, you know, we can be prepared for through some of the work that we can now engage with through some of this. There's always politics within the civic space itself. There's a lot of dynamics there's this entire attempt to NGOize the civic space, and there's a lot of work that we have to do to make sure that we maintain the struggle on the level of the civic space, and it's not, you know, a struggle to become yet another NGO in this republic of NGOs. So it does come with a lot of challenges, but at least the driver behind it is to be aware that the agency that we need to hold to as civic actors and as political actors, as citizens, does not end with the fall of the Assad, because violence and reconstruction, you know, we've seen signs of it that Assad tried to market for, but but if anything, the Assad regime only laid the ground for this that now can still be implemented on the hands of the new authorities. And as I said, red flags are there already, so how do we engage to make sure that, you know, we're not contributing to that?
Great. So, I mean, yeah, obviously we could talk extensively about all this, and you know, even in the prep that we did for this, there's so much more to unpack around uneven geographies of the conflict. And you know, we were here in Sweden, where Sawsan is from, to Homs, where Ammar is from, and you know, thinking about secondary cities in relation to what then happened in Damascus and places like Aleppo, and all of these other different dynamics. So I could talk with you both for the entire evening, but I know there are questions out there, so I will turn to you, dear audience, and if I could ask you to state your name and association, and then to ask a question. And I will take 3, and then I will call it a night. And we have our first one.
Hi, I'm Leila. I'm a PhD student at Goldsmiths, and I'm also in one of the endless numbers of NGOs, of Syrian NGOs that exist out there helping me out. First, a quick acknowledgement that I've been following both Sawsan and Ammar's work for years, and I'm just so grateful that we're having this discussion today. Even 6 months after the fall of the downfall of the Assad regime, it's still absolutely mind-blowing to me that we can be having this discussion and not that discussion. And so I'm very sorry for jumping the gun, but and not talking about violence and what happened in the past years. But I guess my question is, we've heard over the weekend, as a, you know, in paid announcement, they announced this new reconstruction project in Homs. And so I haven't looked into the details, but I was wondering if the two of you had any details on what you thought about this and what are the risks. Like, I haven't looked at all into the figures or associated with this new project, but yeah, if you could talk about this, I'd be so grateful.
Great. I'm going to ask you to respond directly because I'm going to take 2 more questions after this.
Do you want to take the question?
No, just respond.
So just quickly, I remember once in one of the interviews I did for my research on Reconstruction, one participant told me that Reconstruction is like a cake, and there's a Reconstruction cake. Everyone wants a piece of it. But sometimes the local people wouldn't have a piece of it, or they wouldn't even be part of the recipe of the cake. And now what we are seeing in Syria, this project that was announced recently, it's by a Syrian who's based in the Gulf countries, so particularly in Saudi Arabia. He is from Homs. People just woke up one day and they found like these posters everywhere in the streets, Boulevard al-Nasr, the Victory Boulevard. It is on the land that was taken, to my knowledge, was taken by Assad from its people forcibly. So there is a big question that, it's linked to Emma's conversation about, the legal aspect of all of this. On first of all, the legal aspect, but also where is any voice of consultation, and how could the company just like propose a project and they get approval? I don't know if they get approval or not, but how come like it's suddenly happening without any public consultation and on the land that maybe it has a lot of legal questions about it? But what we are gonna witness in the future, I imagine there will be a lot of Syrians and other companies maybe who aren't from Syrian background in the Gulf countries who might be interested. You might have like companies coming from Turkey, but imagine like company like Norman Foster is designing things in Kharkiv and in Ukraine, or post earthquake in Turkey. So all these big questions of the international or regional conversation on who has the right to shape the future, whose voice is being heard, it's a very big question we are facing now.
There was a question here.
Kelly Strong, Syria Notes. This builds on the things you were saying already. I just wondered if you could say something about what are the local challenges, local capacities for politically organising communities to seek to protect their interests.
Yeah, do you want to take another question? Or? Yeah. I think these times are very interesting in the history, in the making of Syria itself, and in the history of Syria, because I think that the headline is ambiguity in what's happening today. And I think that the current authorities coming with their very heavy past into power, they have multiple constituencies to cater for, and they're very aware of that. And in that sense, there's some sort of chaos in place that I would say is orchestrated, is not just, absolutely things are getting out of control. Certain aspects of that are in place, so to cater for the needs of the different groups and the different constituencies until the power balance comes to a better situation. And in that sense, I would say the civic space have been left to a large extent with little control than what we've expected. But it also comes in, so I want to acknowledge the heavy legacy of the Assad regime, particularly in also governing the civic space and in the attempts of people to organize and mobilize and act. The legacy has as I've seen it, has also been in the mentality of how people think about the civic space and the space that we have in general to mobilize and organize. Because it was for decades, it was dictated by the need to seek the approval and of the authorities in place. Now there is nothing much concretely that would make us conclude that the same restrictions apply in today, but it's the mentality through which many are approaching this with high sensitivity that's leading to this. And I think that it's the authorities are making use of this, but in general, I would say it's a space to push boundaries today and to define the space that we want for the future. So, are there challenges for people to politically organize in terms of restrictions imposed by the authority? I would say not very much. But the challenges are in the mentality of how we're dealing with our ability to mobilize and organize, given the heavy legacy of the Assad regime on the one aspect. This is in relation to the government and the current authorities. And on the second hand, it's also, I would say, in our ability to engage horizontally because of, again, the complex layers of victimhood, you know, along sectarian lines, socioeconomic lines, political lines, the whole division between inside and outside, etc. So there are so many aspects that would, I would say, contribute to polarization in today's Syria. And to be able to politically organize and descend above these divisions is something that's very hard, because eventually, for me, what makes a difference is the ability for our efforts to mobilize and organize to remain connected to the constituencies to which we and I think this is one of the very big challenges that we've faced over the past 15 years as civil society actors, is that we became more relevant to the decision-making networks and circles more than we are relevant to the same communities and people that we're supposed to be representing the interests of. So I think there are challenges also in that sense if we look at the polarization that's in place today.
Okay. I'm going to take the last two questions here and we'll take them both.
There's one.
Yeah, one here. What bring this
Hi, thank you. My name is Sammy Keel. I'm a non-resident research fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and a co-founder of a Syrian youth initiative called the Change for Syria Network. Thank you very much for this panel. My question for speakers would be, what is the risk of reinforcing or continuing the doctrine of the useful Syria implemented by the Assad regime under the current administration? And how can we ensure that Reconstruction remains just across all of Syria, not just the western side of Syria? Thank you very much.
And the question at the back.
Hello, my name is Ariana. I'm an independent researcher and I also study here at DPU. I wanted to pick up on something that Ammar said. When you talked about the person you met who said that the Syrian who didn't even live a single bullet. My partner is from El Salvador and he grew up during the civil war there. And he always talks about how he's not a child of the war because of the kids in the countryside who are the children of the war, not him. Because the war didn't come to the city until the last year of it. So I wanted to sort of ask all of you, or any of you really, how to build, as Ammar said, that space where you can ask questions about violence together, across time, across distance, when there's sort of this attempt sometimes by people who have lived this violence to minimize the violence of displacement, the violence of exile, the violence of experiencing less time or more time, how do you overcome some of those divisions where people delegitimize or not delegitimize, but to minimize this kind of, causes this kind of Olympics of suffering? Thanks.
Ammar, do you want to take that one?
I think maybe I can speak a little bit on this one because, like as you mentioned this word like Operation Olympics or Olympiad al-Mu'anat al-Mazlumiyya or the Suffering Olympics or somehow. And I think like some people who would meet a Syrian inside the country who's coming from abroad, they think that their life is very glamorous, and sometimes that's true, and in many other cases it's untrue. So some people who might be living, let's say, in harsh living conditions in diaspora might not even have the ability to book their ticket and fly into the country, So it might be very difficult to afford even like returning to their country if they are living in a refugee camp or if they are, under like extreme living conditions. But of course there are Syrians who are very, well established, who have their businesses, who have, affluent life abroad in diaspora. And I think it's a really like a way to create a bridge between these two and to deal, with these different struggles that each of them has faced. And I think like to also look at opportunities what each of them can bring. And I think what would be a big danger, in my opinion, which is happening and might happen, is that a Syrian who's going from, let's say, a strong background or strong university, Oxford or Cambridge, blah, 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 and then go and tell people like I'm better or I understand better, or having like Orientalist view that I am better because I studied in Germany or in Sweden or in New York, and you studied in Homs or Idlib or Hama. So this is definitely like, if we are talking about recipes of disasters, this is definitely like one of these disasters. And I think if these people want to do something genuinely effective and they want to really, as Khalid Khalifa, who wrote a book called Death is a Hard Work, if we want to really share the pain with each other and feel like, okay, what can we do after the survival guilt? How can we create spaces that we can effectively work together, bring our strengths, and create co-collaboration, co-learning environment, instead of saying like, I'm here to tell you what is right and what's wrong for you. And I think there's a lot to learn, and I think like Sawsan is like, I really feel like jealous of what she's doing, but she's doing like great work on this. And I think like just bringing, this sense of hope and energy and excitement and opportunities to create spaces that we can say, this country is for everyone. Nobody wanted to leave. We were forced to leave, We were like dreaming of our city every day, thinking of Homs or Sweda, leaving our families behind. You left without your family, I left without my family. But how can we do it in a meaningful way that does not cause harm or hurt people's feelings?
Thanks, Ammar. You want to?
On Sami's point, I think these are exactly the type of questions that we need to engage with, so that we don't reproduce, reconstruction as violence again. And again, I would say I can feel that there's a tendency to go in that direction. The current authorities have a very big challenge to re-establish themselves amongst Syrians, different Syrians as different constituencies, and in the international community. And for that, it seems that they are rushing to low-hanging fruits, to big achievements that they can market on the, at the expense of taking the time to really understand the suffering and the multiple and complex layers of oppression that and I don't want to call it victimhood, but it's really oppressions that people had to go through, so that they can plan the future in a way that is more sustained, because it touches the lives of the Syrian people. The urban-rural question is definitely one that needs to be unpacked here, and it fits directly in reproducing this useful Syria, but it's also a question of some of the marginalized governorates, being Sweda, Dar'a, the southern region where I come from, or the eastern parts, which, funny enough, I would say, these two regions are today amongst the regions that are not, how do I put it? I think so. When I think of Syria today, I think of the heart of it, the useful Syria, and I see three different regions hanging by a thread with this heart. And that's the coastal region, and that's particularly because in the minds of people, it used to be the Hadini of the Assad regime. Now, what's Hadini? the incubator of the Assad regime and its supporters, even if it was not, but it's in the minds of people as such. And then there's the southern region, particularly Sweden, and that's the eastern region that's controlled by majority Kurds, etc. There's something that, the marginalization of these regions, I think, makes people more inclined to focusing on decentralization today and making sure that they have a say in how they govern. Now, I know that geopolitics plays in here, and there are so many, there are interests on so many levels. There are, like, the struggle of the people might not necessarily be represented. It's hijacked by armed actors, by religious actors, etc. But I think there's something that we need to engage with in here. It's not a coincidence that the marginalized regions are the ones that are very keen on decentralization now and ensuring that there is, and it's a fair question to engage with. Unfortunately, it's not a question that's given enough time to think of. It's a very weaponized terminology to engage with, and today it's perceived as a threat to the legitimacy and the power of the current authorities. So we're not even allowed to engage with this question to see how can it be useful to us. And I think these are the patterns that would lead us to reproduce the useful Syria as in the Assad era, because unfortunately we're not given the time and any attempts to kind of take the time to think of these very hard and difficult questions are immediately faced with accusations of, you know, خيانة and عمالة الإرهاب وعمالة الاستعمار and colonialism, etc. So yeah, this is why I say there are red flags in place today, but we need to keep the struggle.
We need to keep the struggle. A lot of work to do.
Yeah.
The next book is just going to be Reconstructing Syria.
Yeah.
It will be out around 2032. Please put it in your diaries now. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Sawsan, Ammar, Wendy, Emma. Thank you, everyone.